Hello, my name's Amy Haye. I'm a fashion curator, a dress historian and a writer. My current project is an exhibition called Ravishing the Rose in Fashion, which is an exhibition which is going to open at the Museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology early next year, where I'm working with curator Colleen Hill. And the exhibition is going to look at how the rose has inspired the way we look, feel and fantasise, dating back from the 18th century to the sort of latest gender neutral and Alexander McQueen sort of catwalk trends. The book has come out as scheduled, and I've got an advance copy by Yale University Press. And also, I'm really, really pleased and honoured because in the book, Nick Knight let me use his sublimely beautiful Roses from My Garden images. I work at London College of Fashion. I'm joint director with amazing exhibition maker, Professor Judith Clark, of the University of the Arts Research Centre for Fashion Curation. So I've got six PhD students, mostly practice-based, looking at completely incredible subjects, from how to exhibit gender-neutral fashion in museum contexts when, amongst other things, the mannequins and the documentation has always been very binary gendered. Of time on my hands, I wrote to Charlotte Knight and asked if she might like me to write a series of essays called Fashion in a Time of Crisis. And the idea was prompted by the mass panic buying of food at the outbreak of COVID and all the shortages on the supermarket shelves. And it just started making me really think about all the shortages in both world wars and draw parallels. I'm going to talk about the four subjects that we looked at, which is food shortages, racism, homophobia, and Nazi control of the Paris haute couture industry. The final story I wrote with Bella Gladman. We looked at the impact of the coronavirus on the creative industries. What unites my work is constructing narratives or telling stories about people's lives, artists, designers, makers, wearers, observers, collectors, and using dress as my primary source of evidence. Mostly I work with objects in museum collections and documents in archives. Moving on to fashion in a time of crisis. The first story I looked at was food because, as I said, that was what sort of prompted the whole series. And I've been interested in the Women's Land Army for years and years. I bought this portrait of a land girl from the First World War in 1981 when I was a student studying dress history at Brighton University. And what really struck me was the modernity of this woman's dress, appearance, demeanour. It was at a time when yoji and com were just coming out on the catwalks, that workwear was becoming fashionable. Today, as in 1914 and 1939 in fact, Britain as an island nation imports well over half of all the food consumed, which makes us in a very, very vulnerable position, especially in times of crisis like war. It wasn't until the point that food supplies had almost run out that a Women's Land Army was formed. Young women, as young as 17, many had never even visited the country, and nor had they worn trousers. Some were sent on 3-week training courses, the image you can see here, proudly wearing their uniform. They're wearing white smocks, which meant that they worked in the dairies, couples. They were socially isolated, and they frankly were met with quite a lot of hostility. This is a label of a rare pair of breeches from the First World War that I found in the Imperial War Museum, showing the detail of the breeches from 1917. There was a widespread feeling that they'd come from the cities. They were promiscuous. They looked overtly masculine within quite conservative rural communities because they were away from their families. Their independence posed a threat. But ultimately, it was their uniformed appearance that helped form a lot of the negative perceptions about them. And this uniform that they were issued with formed part of their daily lives. It reshaped their bodies and identities, and it really did influence broader perceptions of them. And when we look at this rare colour photograph, which was published by the Daily Mail, you can really see quite how different the women did look from the land girl, even though she's not even wearing proper uniform, but on the right in her breeches, compared to the agricultural women workers who were wearing blouses as opposed to a smock and long skirts. So all the time the women are being portrayed partly in a good-humoured way, but also in a slightly fearful way that they were going to be part of this whole new generation of post-war masculine women. They never got the perks that other forces enjoyed, and they didn't get the recognition afterwards. Even up until about 2008, they weren't allowed to march, and the Second World War land girls weren't allowed to march to the cenotaph of the other forces. And as a result, they were often described as Cinderellas of the soil, which was the name of the exhibition I curated. And the next story was about racism and the Zoot Suit riots. And it's important to say from the outset that this isn't an area of my subject expertise, and the real expert on the subject is my friend and colleague, Professor Carol Tulloch, whose most recent book, The Birth of Cool, is completely amazing. Zoot suits were first seen in the 1930s in Harlem swing clubs and dance halls, and it was a subcultural creation rather than the creation of one particular designer or tailor. And the name Zoot was believed to derive from bebop rhyming slang, with zoot rhyming with suit. It was a flamboyant style that revelled in conspicuous consumption, and for many young Black and Latino people, it became a very visible assertion of their identity and a refusal to be treated as subservient second-class citizens in a society that really was, and still in many extents is, racist. So the Zoot Suit comprised a very long single-breasted waisted jacket with broad padded shoulders, wide lapels, diagonal side pockets, and there were lots and lots of buttons going up the wrists. Fabrics were brightly coloured, often patterned. In his autobiography, Malcolm X talks quite a lot about seeing people wearing suits, and at age 15 going to get his own Zoot Suit, which he managed to get on a recommendation on credit, and he chose one that he described as sky blue, and just felt amazing wearing it. The trousers were cut ultra high, almost up to the armpits, and then they tapered from being very, very wide down to very, very narrow, so that you could move with ease, but you weren't going to trip when you were dancing the Lindy Hop. And then central to the look was a long, chunky watch chain that hung in a loop from the waistband right down below the jacket hem. And it was mostly a male style, but not exclusively. There were women who wore the jacket with tight skirts and high-heeled shoes. It started in the clubs, but it became brought to much wider attention when it was adopted by leading jazz musicians like Dizzy Gillespie, Louis Armstrong, and Cab Calloway. But this extraordinary suit, completely original, was bought in 2016 by LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum, for their amazing exhibition on menswear called Raining Men. They paid $80,000 for it at auction, and it's possibly the only Zoot Suit that's in a museum collection worldwide, and it's brilliant because it has been preserved. Wearing a Zoot Suit was always a radical proposition, but with the onset of the Second World War in America, it became an object of absolute conflict. In March 1942, rationing was introduced in America, which basically outlawed wearing a Zoot Suit which was made from huge quantities of fabric, although some backstreet tailors were prepared to do so for a price. During the first week of 1943, in mid and downtown Los Angeles, riots erupted. Young Latin African and other ethnic minority young men, along with a handful of Caucasians, had their precious Zoot Suits slashed with knives. They were also clubbed, and they were publicly stripped to their underwear. The aggressors, mobs of off-duty police officers and sailors out on shore leave. Now, this amazing image, which in many respects could be recaptioned Yohji Yamamoto from the 1990s, shows three young boys, Walker Roberts, 12, Henry Campbell, 14, and Morris Jackson, 13. And they're photographed feeling $1 million, showing off their new Zoot style suits, which are in fact tuxedos that they'd looted from a formal menswear shop during the Harlem riots in 1943. Now, despite or because of the violence, Zoot Suit became an icon of rebellion for decades to come. It informed the style of suits worn by wartime spiffs and teddy boys, these early teddy boys seen here from the 1950s. And it was more diligently, even fanatically, revived in the early 1980s by New Romantics, Blitz Kids, and singers such as Kid Creole and Chris Sullivan, who we can see here, who was the lead singer in the band Blue Rondo a la Turk. But the vital issue here is, of course, the ongoing racism and violence across the globe against people of colour, not only in the 1940s, but right up until the present day. This year, many ethnic minority peoples are bearing the brunt of the coronavirus crisis. They're occupying frontline jobs. Those in work, for those in work, and those out of work are facing the worst food and other essential shortages. Black Lives Matter was a movement established in the US in 2013. It's now known worldwide following the outrage about the highly publicised and significantly filmed murder of 46-year-old George Floyd on May the 25th, followed by the also filmed shooting of Jacob Blake in front of his 4 children on August 23rd. The next story, also about horrific violence, and also taking place in the Second World War, explores the Nazi occupation of Paris and the impact it had upon the Parisian haute couture industries during the Second World War. This photograph shows Nazis marching into Paris on the 14th of June 1940. And clearly the mass genocide of the Nazis orchestrated should never be forgotten, although it would seem that humanity is clearly not yet learned from their barbaric atrocities. But in keeping with the fashion theme of this series, the focus of the story was about how Nazi occupation of Paris impacted the haute couture industries, the designers and clients. And the real expert in this field is the French historian Dominique Vaillant, who's written a book called Fashion Under the Occupation. Within days of the occupation, many international designers left Paris, and here we've got the forces queuing up, waiting to buy the Chanel perfume to take home. During the occupation, Chanel lived at the Ritz Hotel, which she'd lived at before the war, but during the war it was requisitioned by senior Nazi officers, and there she lived with her lover, Hans Gunther von Dinklage, a high-ranking Nazi officer. Meanwhile, many thousands of highly skilled Jewish workers and minority groups, including people who now self-identify as LGBTQ, engaged in fashion and its ancillary trades throughout Europe, were to have their businesses shut down or taken over. They were persecuted and they were murdered. Dispensation was made for a few fur workers, as the German forces required their specialist skills to make warm apparel for soldiers fighting on the Russian front. These are some fashion images from 1939, just before Nazi occupation. They're both by the most amazing designer called Lucien Lelong, about whom not a lot is known today. Amazing photograph of a model wearing a neo-romantic gown on the Eiffel Tower, and on the right an illustration of another corseted neo-romantic gown, illustrated by Christian Berard, who I think is my favourite fashion illustrator. Adolf Hitler became perhaps peculiarly preoccupied with the Parisian haute couture industries. Yet he denounced Paris fashion and the slender feminine bodies it idealised as decadent and corruptive to what he perceived to be noble and natural, in inverted commas, Aryan women. Instead, he extolled the virtues of German or regional dress, including dirndl skirts, and also women in uniform, significantly both of which were made on home soil, because he was completely anti-imports. Yet, he was completely enamoured by the glamour and the cultural cachet of Parisian haute couture. He thus determined to relocate the industry to Berlin as part of his broader plan to make the German capital the centre of world culture. Lucien Lelong, whose clothes I just showed you, in his capacity as president of the trade organisation the Chambre Syndicale de la Couture Parisienne, was summoned to Paris, to Berlin, to discuss the logistics of this. Hitler is completely convinced he wants to move the whole industry lock, stock and barrel, and he's a complete fantasist. So after much persuasion and diplomacy, Lelong managed to persuade him that it simply wasn't possible, that Paris fashion could only survive in Paris and Paris, that it was part of a broader culture, not least all the vital ancillary trades which supported it, the flower makers. And so after much persuasion, Hitler agreed that the industry could remain in Paris, but it would actually be absolutely controlled by the Nazis. Henceforth, all exports upon which the industry depended so vitally were stopped. From that moment on, communication with the outside world was severed. And it's at this point, interestingly, as an aside, that cut off from Paris, that actually New York and London start really asserting their own fashion identities. So this slide shows an image. The colour image, the illustration, is Daywear by the couturier Jacques Fat, and on the right is a photograph of a model wearing Balenciaga. During the war, about 85 houses remained open. But henceforth, their new clientele comprised the wives and lovers of Nazi officers, other collaborators, and also wartime profiteers. And they, along with the most wealthy French women who were prepared to socialise with the Nazis, had to apply for special dispensation. They were given vouchers, which meant they were allowed to place orders for Parisian haute couture. Now, the Nazis allowed the couture industry to continue, but they said that the amount of fabrics used had to be reduced by half, by 50%. So the couturiers, this is why the shorts are, there's a lot of fullness in the skirts. They concentrated fabrics in areas, but other areas are tight fitted. And there was a lot of sort of upswept, very elaborate hats, bishop or batwing sleeves, peplums on jackets and dresses were popular, with very, very tight waists. This tiny minority are wearing haute couture. Most of the French nation is suffering unbelievably. Germans put in place a coupon system where clothes were rationed, but most people couldn't even afford to buy new clothes anyway. So as ever, the second-hand market flourished and old clothing was repurposed. There was lots and lots of patchwork clothing, and at their best, some of these garments, we could liken them to abstract paintings. And I was also quite interested to look at these because at the time of writing, it was when the new collections were being shown, not on the catwalk. And I'd noticed there was lots of patchwork. And these skirts and dresses were known as La Robe Mille Morceaux, the dress of a million pieces. Hand-stitched by women from old clothes, which were probably redolent with meaning that had belonged to family members, to create vital garments for themselves and others. And the couturiers came under a lot of criticism. In many respects, they were considered to collaborate with the regime. But collaboration is a contentious and complex subject. Certainly some designers like Jacques Fath were seen photographed at Nazi receptions with his model wife and would seem to have integrated quite willingly with the Nazi regime. Other designers claimed that they created models that deliberately made their clients look ridiculous. Retrospectively, historians have variously interpreted these wartime activities as collaboration or as an absolutely necessary survival strategy, not least one that ensured the livelihoods of some 12,000 workers. The final story I'm going to discuss today is the devastating global impact that AIDS had around the world, but with the focus of this series again, looking at the broader issues, but looking at them very much through the lens of dress. Now, of all the stories, this was the one that I felt most profoundly, not least because it was a period that I lived through. So for many of us in our 50s and older, the COVID-19 pandemic, a global and indiscriminate virus about which very little is known and for which there's currently no cure, it recalls painful memories of the 1980s and 90s when the AIDS pandemic reached its peak. But unlike COVID, this disease was originally and entirely inaccurately thought to exclusively target one already marginalised section of society, gay men. And as such, within a culture of homophobia, finding a cure was not prioritised. Compelling gay men to protest and campaign for their own equality, for broader visibility, and ultimately that investment be made in the disease and vital medicine and vaccines be found to cure it. By 1982, at the point when the spread of the disease had become rampant and the establishment could no longer ignore it, it was named GRID, which was an acronym for Gay-Related Immune Deficiency, and the debilitating symptoms, including severe weight loss and Kaposi sarcoma, which was the most awful skin cancer, were all the more shocking because they ravaged the lives of the bodies of the young and fit, often the super fit. And in the prevailing climate of fear and bigotry, homophobia and gay bashing became more and more rife. And it wasn't helped by the popular media that fanned the flames by reporting that AIDS, as it later became called, that it could be contracted by any contact with anyone who had the virus or HIV positive, or even items they touched. So they've got ridiculous stories about, if you touch someone that had HIV touched, you were going to get the virus. So it created a complete panic. As with COVID, New York became an epicenter for AIDS, and the effects upon the designers, stylists, photographers, graphic artists, hairdressers, journalists, display artists, showroom and retail workers, and many other creatives that comprise the city's second largest industry and its most highly visible industry significantly, were calamitous. Dr. Valerie Steele, who's the amazing director at the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, where I'm working on the Roses exhibition, has curated scores of exhibitions, including the seminal A Queer History, From the Closet to the Catwalk, which she curated in 2013. And I talked to her about writing this piece, and she told me, and I quote, AIDS had a devastating impact on the fashion world of New York, as it did on the arts in general. Many of the most talented designers died, from Halston to Willie Smith. The atmosphere of fear brought out loathsome bigotry, as male designers were fired if they couldn't prove that they didn't have AIDS. But a committed segment of the fashion industry joined forces with AIDS activists to raise money to help people who were sick and to pressure the government into taking action. Susan Bartsch, the Swiss Miss of Club Life, created the Love Ball, which raised money and morale at a really horrible time. In 1987, the newly launched protest group ACT UP used Silence Equals Death, shown alongside an inverted pink triangle as their slogan. The history and meaning behind this pink triangle evidences humanity at its absolute most barbaric. When Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933, he invoked the criminalisation of homosexuality, which, whilst it dated back to 1871, had barely been invoked. And he rounded up some 100,000 men who were perceived to be gay over the ensuing 12 years. It's shocking that we don't know the numbers, but between 5,000 and 15,000 of these men were sent to the concentration camps as part of his mad and evil quest to purify the German nation. Once there, they were made to wear a prominent pink triangle cloth on their uniforms, and other marginalised groups were classified by different coloured triangles. And what were described as gypsies wore brown, political prisoners red, immigrants blue, and what were described as asocial people, which included lesbians and prostitutes, black. Alongside so many other horrors and the mass murder, men wearing the pink triangle were sterilised, they were subject to medical experiments, bullied and tortured. So in the 1980s, the gay community subverted and inverted this pink triangle to create a pyramid. And the pyramids are shaped long associated with action, change, and healing. The image here is a t-shirt with a design by the amazing artist Keith Haring, who sadly also died of AIDS, campaigning for AIDS awareness. And as we can see, he's written Silence Equals Death and the pink pyramid. By 1990, a feature in New York Times quoted Virginia Estrada. She was sister of the New York designer Angel Estrada, again an amazing designer about whom little is known. She said, "Health has become the most important thing in fashion, more important than the cut of the clothes." And shockingly, she stated that it was when her brother died that the outlook for the company became better. Angel died on the 7th of September 1989. He was 31 years old, and along with other fashion talents, including Willie Smith, who died on the 17th of April 1987, and Patrick Kelly, who died on the 1st of January 1990, they were amongst the designers and people working in the industry who certainly deserve greater recognition within fashion history. Marc Jacobs famously went on to revive the fortunes of Perry Ellis, who died on the 20th of October 1986. And whereas Perry Ellis insisted that his illness be kept secret because he was frightened about the impact it would have on his business after his death, Halston, who died 4 years later, on 26th of March 1990, arranged to have his beloved Rolls-Royce auctioned with all the proceeds going to AIDS research. Within this climate, for the first time ever, financiers considered women designers to be infinitely more investable than male talent, and a lot of male talent was pushed at this time. So it's not a coincidence that the 1990s is often described as the decade of the woman designer. Part of our preparation for death is the sorting out of our personal possessions. We give them away, we safeguard them, or we destroy them. And I would argue that clothing, more than any other media, bears evidence of lives lived. Warm clothing bears evidence of lives lived. It bears testimony to the stains and woes of everyday life. It absorbs our personal sense. It alters according to our body shape, like knitwear stretches or whatever. And as a result, it's often the hardest thing to know what to do with when someone we love dies. And that's partly why the reason that people give their clothes to museums, because if they're amazing designs, they want the design to be preserved, but quite often it's because they want to ensure that the memory and the meaning of those garments is ensured for future eyes. As a dress curator working at the V&A in the 1990s, and subsequently, I'm accustomed to people of all ages coming and donating their own clothes or bequests from people they've loved. But what was really, really shocking in the 1990s was that the demographic shifted completely. A lot of the people coming to give clothes were young men in preparation for their own death, or from people they'd loved or administrators to whom they'd asked to bequeath clothes. It was completely emotionally devastating. Amongst the most memorable donations was a collection of clothes. I was asked if I'd go and look, and I asked the person if they could bring them in, and he said, no, there's just too many. So I went to a flat and was presented with bags and bags and bags of clothes worn by a young man called Rupert Michael Dolan, who was an absolute Vivienne Westwood fanatic. He bought clothes he could wear, from like football leotards that he wore to gay clubs, to sort of Norfolk suits, and he also bought things that he just fell in love with and didn't wear as a collector. He just had to own them. Another group of clothes was a bequest from amazing designers who worked sort of in the spirit of Fortuny, amazing painted and pleated silks, Ian and Marcel again, who both died of AIDS. And I did a display of their clothes and opened, it was a small exhibition, opened it on the 1st of December, World AIDS Day, and persuaded the museum director to let me put a big red ribbon in the museum, in the case. Now, these things don't sound that radical now, but if you backtrack 20, 25 years, it was shocking, and even doing that sort of thing in a museum was daring, and it was, to be honest, it was unprecedented. So since the 1980s, over 30 million people worldwide have died of AIDS. It wasn't until 1996, 1 year after my absolute best friend in the world died, that antiretroviral drugs were developed and ensured people would have longer life expectancy. However, the perceived stigma that continues to be associated with the disease lingers, and it forms a huge barrier to many individuals, families, and communities living around the world, often in societies that are not tolerant, battling with AIDS. Today, plans are afoot to create museum collections to gather oral testimonies and other forms of legacy to mark the current COVID crisis. As with the AIDS crisis, it's already all too apparent that ultimately it's inequality of power, status, and wealth that is the major determinant of who survives and who does not.